Thank you so much, Abdullah, for this kind presentation. First of all, I'd like to thank you, my co-author Statis, for this great invitation. Also, I thank you for this organization of the seminar, and really, it's a great opportunity to present our paper, enhancing entrepreneurial orientation with scenario planning. So today, the outline of this presentation is divided into 5 sessions. First of all, I will present the aim of the article and outline our problem. Next, I will present the theoretical background or framework, the methodology, and the results. Finally, we will conclude by explaining the contribution, that means the theoretical contribution and also the managerial contribution, then limitation and perspective. So let's start by the introduction or the problem of this paper. First of all, after several decades of research in the scenario planning literature, the researchers within the field have come to some consensus with regards to the definition of this concept. That means when we observe, for example, different papers that are published in technological forecasting and social change and other journals, we find some consensus with regard to the definition. How we can define this strategic tool, what are the basic dimensions of its process, its relationship with strategy, and so on. What remains largely under-researched are the outcomes of scenario planning and preparation. And here there is the debate, and here we have, for example, different studies that dealt with this concept, and always we try to understand what are the potential outcomes of scenario planning in practice. So by reviewing this field, we can deduce that the outcomes and affordance can be direct and indirect. And here, for example, some papers which are published, and we talk, for example, the paper of Tapinos on 2012, and which explored the relationship between scenario planning and uncertainty. Also, the work of Sharmak on 2010, and the aim is to explore the relationship between scenario planning and organizational learning, and also the shared model, the shared models. So regarding the indirect ones, for example, here there is a little work that focuses on this aspect, and for example, we can find some exploratory works that dealt with, for example, the relationship between scenario planning and innovation, scenario planning, for example, and strategy development, and so on. So in this paper, based on these different research gaps, we try to invest what is the relationship between scenario planning and the entrepreneurial orientation in organization. And here we focus on 2 different subjects, which are the scenario planning and also the entrepreneurial orientation. So what is the basis of this work? So we consider the definition of work, I think in 1986, who defined scenario planning as a process for rediscovering the original entrepreneurial power of creative foresight in context of accelerated change, greater complexity, and genuine uncertainty. So according to this author, scenario planning is related to the internal capability of the company. That means the entrepreneurial power of the creative foresight. That means when we apply, for example, some techniques of creative foresight, such as scenario planning and others, in very complicated context, which is really characterized by, for example, uncertainty, by change, but also complexity. So for this reason, we consider that scenario planning may improve the entrepreneurial power within organization. Then So the focus of our paper is on whether the use of scenario planning affects the key dimension of entrepreneurial orientation. So here we try to be very precise in terms of definition, because the field of entrepreneurship is very large, and by examining this field you can find, for example, different concepts such as the entrepreneurial orientation, the entrepreneurial intention, the entrepreneurial passion, and so on. So here we try to focus on this concept, which is related to the organization, but also to the manager. And here, for example, the work of Miller in 1983 focused on the importance of this behavior within organization. So I will explain later what are the different dimensions of entrepreneurial orientation. But here the purpose of our study is to propose an integrative model that analyzes the relationship between the different dimensions of scenario planning and also the three dimensions of entrepreneurial orientation. And to do this, we based our work on a quantitative research in order to test these different relationships. So we take as a sector or industry the French healthcare section. So following our research gaps on this brief introduction, we can say that the conceptual model is the following. So at the left of this figure, we have the scenario planning. And the scenario planning, as I said, is measured through, I think, three different dimensions, which are related to the information, the importance of information, then the scenario development, and so on. On the other side, we have the three dimensions of scenario planning, of entrepreneurial orientation, and the three dimensions are related to innovativeness, proactiveness, and risk-taking. So these three dimensions that define what is the entrepreneurial orientation. So we try to control this model by the size of this organization, because as you know, the scenario practice and the entrepreneurial behavior within firms depends on many factors. And especially when we talk about factors, we talk about the size of the company. So we try to discover if the size as a control variable may impact these different relationships. So for our theoretical background, first of all, we try to start by defining what is scenario planning. So here, by examining the literature in this field, we can find, for example, different definition of scenario planning. And here we can distinguish, for example, between the term scenario, what is a scenario, and what is scenario planning. Scenario planning is a process, is an innovative process manifested through developing new capabilities and building new social capital. That means here we talk about the definition, but also the potential outcomes. It promotes through a combination of internal variable and external trends, creativity, innovation, and strategic decision making. So this strategic tool aims to develop some capabilities in order to deal with uncertainty, as Tapina said in 2012, but also to propose some solution in order to deal with this uncertainty. So by examining also the literature, we can find, for example, many studies that are focusing on the origin of this method. And here, for example, there is a paper published by, I think, Bradfield et al. In 2005, but also another one by Amer et al. In 2013, I think. And these papers are concentrating on the origin of this method. That means what is the origin of this method, and what are the different approaches that are developed. And here we can see the SERI International, the trend impact analysis, the cross impact analysis, and so on. There is also another school that compares, for example, the French school of foresight with the different method of scenario planning. And here we'll see, for example, some works of Boots, I think, in 2012, that is explaining the relationship between the strategic foresight and the organizational learning. So here we try to develop this part and say that there is many studies that focus on the definition, but also on the dimension of scenario planning in general. Also, some studies, however, have investigated its effects on organizational skills. And here maybe I will see, for example, Sharmak in 2003 and 6, who is focusing on the relationship between scenario planning and organizational learning, because through this process, the manager or the participant may learns how to manage, for example, uncertainty, how to deal with change, and so on. There are also some qualitative research or exploratory research that try to investigate, for example, the relationship between scenario planning and innovation, but also opportunity identification. So how these different studies are very important to develop this strategic tool, but I think that most of them are exploratory and based on a small sample sizes. So their conclusions are preliminary in terms of outcomes. So, so based on this brief introduction, so we try to mobilize the concept of entrepreneurial orientation. So the question that we can ask at this level, why we try to understand the potential relationship between scenario planning and entrepreneurial orientation. So our basis is the scenario planning literature. And as I said, the definition that is developed by Watt in 1986, and the aim to say that the scenario planning is a tool, among others, that may develop, for example, the entrepreneurial behavior within organization. So here we try to explore this relationship by focusing on the entrepreneurial orientation. So I take the definition of Anderson and al. in 2009, and they considered the entrepreneurial orientation that is a strategy making practices, management philosophies, and firm level behavior that are entrepreneurial in nature. That means, if you'd like to understand this concept is defined through two aspects. We have the strategy practices, that means what are the different steps of decision making within an organization, but also what are the different management philosophies and the aim to be entrepreneurial in nature. So we have different kinds of companies. For example, Mainsberg, I think in 1979, he's talking about the different types of organization. And by defining the entrepreneurial organization is an organization that is oriented toward, for example, innovative activity, proactiveness, and risk-taking. And here we focus on the definition that is given by Coven and Slavin in 1989. And according to these authors, the entrepreneurial orientation is defined through three dimensions, which are innovativeness, proactiveness, and risk-taking. And here, by examining the literature, we can find, of course, different other definitions. For example, Lampkin and Des in 1996, he's talking about 5 dimensions that may define this concept, which is the entrepreneurial orientation. So let's discover together what are the different dimensions of entrepreneurial orientation, and we will start with innovativeness. So according to Lampkin, it is in 1996, innovativeness is the ability to innovate, reflects therefore the tendency to engage in support new ideas, a creative process, or an experiment in the development of a new technology and practice. So here is, if we try to summarize this first dimension, is the ability of a company to innovate and to be creative in terms of, for example, products, services, but also technology and practice. The second dimension is related to proactiveness, and this level of proactiveness within a firm refers to a process which are aimed at seeking a new opportunity, the introduction of new products and brands ahead of a competition. So the second dimension is the ability of the company to be proactive, and of course in terms of seeking new opportunities. And here, for example, there is an article published by Shane and Venkataraman in 2004, and these authors are focusing on the opportunity process, so how the company is able to identify but also to use this opportunity in order to develop, for example, new products or explore a new market. So the aim to be proactive, that means to understand, to anticipate the environment in order to be more effective in terms of decision making. So the last dimension is related to the risk taking, and here the term risk taking, it involves implementing bold actions that require investment of considerable resources, yet provide no certainty about obtaining profit. That means here there is the engagement or the commitment of some manager to take a very risky activities that are not certain in terms of profit. And here I will make some links between these different dimensions and the scenario planning. And here, for example, when we see, for example, the articles that are published in the field of scenario planning, we can find these different terms and concepts that are related, for example, to uncertainty, to opportunity identification, to learning, and so on. And the aim is to understand the evolution of environment through the development of different scenarios, and the aim is to make the suitable decision for the company. So this is what the different the definition of entrepreneurial orientation concepts. So to test this relationship, or to understand this relationship between scenario planning dimension and entrepreneurial orientation dimension, here we mobilized a quantitative methodology based on the questionnaire. So here we have the aim or the methodology is to develop based on some scales that are developed in literature to test this different relationship, and if really there is a relationship between these different concepts. So we mobilized, or we used the healthcare sector in France in order to test this relationship. So the question that we may ask at this level, why we focus on this sector or this industry? First of all, this industry is characterized by profound changes and uncertainty, and require always adaptation, anticipation, and good management quality. And we see last time, this period when you have the pandemic period, that this healthcare industry is very important, and also the innovation must be developed in order to answer to different changes, but also to anticipate or to propose to anticipate the future changes within this environment. In France, this sector or this industry is also characterized by an evolutive, legislative, and regulatory context of health policy. So here we distinguish in France different kind of organization within the sector. We can find, for example, the commercial organization. We can find the public sector, but also we can find also the not-for-profit organization. And this, we have different method of management, because the management is related to the financial resources, to the human resources, and so on. So the complexity of the sector is very important to study in order to discover how these organizations are managers, how the manager are developing scenario planning, and to try to anticipate and understand the evolution of the environment. And so to test our different relationship, we use I think answers or responses from 1,033 persons in this sector, and all of them are using scenario planning in their decision-making process. So we have the first sample is composed, I think, of 982 persons or managers, and some of them they don't use scenario planning, but the final answer, which is the rate, is approximately 15%, and all of them are using scenario planning in their process. So they try to develop different scenarios. They try to use the strategic foresight in their decision-making process. So before talking about the results or the empirical model, these results, we try to study or to investigate the reliability and the validity of the measurement model. As you know, there is different steps in order to test the reliability and the validity of different concepts. And here, all the indicator of our model, here I'm talking about the indicator. We have, for example, information acquisition, knowledge dissemination, scenario development. We have innovativeness, risk-taking, and proactiveness. And all of these dimensions are tested in terms of reliability and validity. Furthermore, to discriminant validity, for example, was tested through the Furnell and Larkert 1981 approach. That means we have, for example, to test the average variance extracted, then also to compare between the relationship between the different dimensions, and so on. So the final results, or the results, the output of the smart PLS software are in our model. So if you'd like to study these different statistics, we can find that here. I'm sorry, if you see, for example, the table, what are the different, for example, the standard deviation, the t statistics, and the p-values. And here, for example, if we examine the different relationship, for example, for the first hypothesis, which is the relationship between innovativeness and scenario planning. So here the results indicate that the relationship is not significant. That means scenario planning, according to our sample is not significant, or the relationship is not significant between the two aspects. However, for example, the scenario planning has a positive impact on risk-taking and proactiveness. This is the two hypotheses are confirmed by our sample. What else? Then, regarding, for example, the control effect of size, that means the innovativeness is related to the size. That means, for example, the size impact positively innovativeness. But by the same thing for, I think, for risk taking, that means the size impact has a positive impact on risk-taking, but there is no significant impact between the size and the proactiveness. This is the aim of this path coefficients. First of all, we try to test our different hypotheses, but also we try also to validate the relationship or the scenario planning dimension. So, as you know, after doing or after testing the reliability, but also the validity, we try also to test the relationship between scenario planning and the different dimensions. And we find here, and according to the p-value, but also to the t statistics, we can see that there is a strong relationship between information acquisition, knowledge dissemination, and scenario development with scenario planning. That means, in other words, for example, you can find, for example, different definition of scenario planning. And for example, there is the paper of Shermak, I think, on 2010. He's talking about, for example, relationship between scenario planning and mental model and learning and so on. But there is no empirical study, and here we try to develop this empirical study in order to test this relationship. So we confirm that through this study, of course, that scenario planning is defined through the first part, which is the information acquisition. The second step is knowledge dissemination, but also the third one is the scenario development. And these results confirm some studies, and especially I will cite the paper of O'Brien's, I think, in 2013, who is talking about the different steps of scenario planning. And in their article, they said that the first step is to prepare the scenario planning. That means to understand the environment through, for example, the pestle analysis, through, for example, the strategic analysis. Then we have to gather different information and knowledge. Then the last one, the step, is related to scenario development. That means the aim is to develop these scenarios and to integrate them into the decision-making process. This is for our model. So what are the contribution of this paper? So several theoretical applications derived from the study, and especially here we make two principal applications. The first one, to answer the research gap or the problem that there is a limited knowledge regarding the interaction between strategic factors and entrepreneurial orientation. By examining the literature, we find that that little study or limited studies that try to understand the relationship between, for example, strategy and entrepreneurial orientation. And recently, in 2020, there is some new papers that try to explore this relationship, and especially for example, they mobilize the term, for example, flexibility, the agility, in order to understand the relationship between them and the entrepreneurial behavior. So here, this is the first study that tried to examine how scenario planning affects the different dimensions of entrepreneurial orientation. And as I said, this study is based on different articles that are published in different journals. And the aim is to understand if scenario planning in practice may improve or develop the entrepreneurial behavior within companies. And here, as I said, we focus on the size as a control variable, but because we are sure that this relationship depends on the size of the company, but also on the industry. And after that, I will mention this later. So in reviewing the literature on scenario planning, we found that the majority of research has focused on the theoretical framework and theory related to it. I will take the example of Derbyshire. This author mobilized, I think, the surprise theory in order to understand the scenario planning. But also, as I said, different other papers which are focusing on the approach of scenario planning, and the aim is to have a consensus, to have always the theoretical development of this tool or the strategic tool. Second, we contribute or we confirm some exploratory studies dealing with scenario planning benefits for the company. As I said, for example, Vishatu in 2019, then Worthington et al. In 2009 tried to explore, for example, the relationship between innovation and scenario planning, then opportunity identification and scenario planning, and so on. And our work is here to complete or to investigate with a set of data, that means a very important data from the sector, and say what is the relationship between scenario planning and entrepreneurial orientation. So regarding the managerial contribution, so a number of managerial applications ensue for our study, because we suggest that the specificity of this industry, that means the healthcare industry, require organizational skills that facilitate the flexibility and agility in terms of services in order to meet the requirement of user. Those requires evolve continuity. That means nowadays we are talking about the evolution or the change of the customer needs in terms of services and in terms of products. And nowadays, for example, after this pandemic, we are talking about the digital sector or the digital health in order to enhance the quality of service in this sector. And to do this, we have to develop some entrepreneurial activities in order to develop innovation, in order to develop also the invention in this sector. So we suggest that leaders introduce this planning into their decision-making process to cope with the uncertainty, but also to cope with the accelerating change in their environment. Finally, it would certainly be desirable for them to recognize the importance of entrepreneurship in their business. And here I'm talking about the corporate entrepreneurship. That means how we can develop entrepreneurship within their organization through, for example, innovation, through open innovation. That means the collaboration between different stakeholders, but also how to be innovative and to answer to the requirement of different users. So what are the limitations of our paper? So the first limitation is related to the sample, because our study is based on a single country and one single also sector, which can affect the generalization of the results to other contexts. So this is the first limitation of our paper. Then we can, for example, introduce other institutional characteristics in order to understand the manager behavior, for example, to understand the environment, uncertainty, and so on. So future researchers may focus on samples from other countries, but also we can compare, for example, between different industries, and the aim to have, for example, scientific results and to have to generalize results to other sectors. So last thing, I said that many other factors that may be added to our analysis, such as, for example, the organizational learning, the degree of innovation, but also some aspects related to the culture in order to understand the scenario planning. I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'm here to answer to your different questions.
Thank you very much, Arafet. That was very insightful. Any questions for Arafet? Can you raise your electronic hand? The floor is open for questions. Status, you want to say something?
Yeah, I've got a question, but it's not for Arafet, it's for the participants. So basically, I've got a question for those who are doing scenario planning, how they felt about our classification of outcomes as direct or indirect, and as affordances, as intended, unintended. So I've looked a lot in the literature. There are very, very few mentions on this. So it is a little bit walking on thin ice. So I would like people who are doing research on scenario planning foresight, their opinion on this. And those people who are doing entrepreneurship, I would be very curious to see how they feel about the research outcome of a strategy tool affecting entrepreneurial orientation.
Okay, thanks, Statis. Anybody wants to come on these points or ask any other questions? I think Vivek wants to say something. Vivek, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah. Hi, can you hear me? I'm Vivek.
Yes.
So I'm doing research on horizon scanning and scenario planning. So firstly, your research is very interesting. One, because very few quantitative methods on scenario planning. And second, as you rightly identified, very few research on the impact of scenario planning. But being in the stage of designing my research right now, I'm much more curious on, I mean, you have established certain criterias on the impact of scenario planning, but can you please go into the depth about, in the questionnaire, how did you establish, for example, you say there's a relation between scenario planning and innovation or information dissemination. Can you please throw some light on how did you design in capturing this information from your surveys? I hope I'm clear in my question.
Mm-hmm. Abdullah, can I answer the question?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. So thank you so much for your question, which is very interesting. So as you said that there is a little works in quantitative research in scenario planning and how to measure scenario planning through the different dimensions. So here you see the figure that scenario planning is measured through 3 dimensions. That means, for example, the information acquisition, the knowledge dissemination, and scenario development. And here we develop different items to measure them. So I didn't put this in this presentation, but in our paper we have development, for example, how to measure information acquisition. This dimension is measured through 3 questions. The same for knowledge dissemination, we have used 5 questions. And for scenario development, we have used 4 items. And here we use the Likert scale from 1 to 7. For example, I will take example. Do you agree with if your company is using, for example, gathering information from 1 to 7, and if the degree of information gathering is very high, the respondent will make 7, and if the degree is very low, he will make 1, for example. And here, these different items which are used are tested in terms of reliability, and in terms of validity. That means here we have to test the relationship between, if there is, for example, a relationship between information acquisition and the 3 dimension. And here you can see the scores, for example, that confirm that there is a very significant relationship between them. So we use different items in order to measure to give some indicators to the respondent in order to answer and to understand what is scenario planning.
Thank you.
That's it.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Any further questions from the floor? I can ask a question myself.
Yeah.
In fact, this is just the right slide that I wanted to ask my question.
Mm-hmm.
How do you resolve reverse causality issue? I mean, you relate risk-taking, proactiveness, and innovativeness on scenario planning,
Mm-hmm.
but what is the direction of the effect here?
Yeah, the direction of the effect. Here, the direction of the effect is from scenario planning to innovativeness, for example. This is the first hypothesis. So the first one, we said that based on the theoretical development, we said that scenario planning has a positive impact on innovativeness. Okay. The second is the same hypothesis. Scenario planning has a positive impact on risk taking. And the last one, that scenario planning is has a positive impact on proactiveness. So to test this direction and this relationship, we have in this output, which is the Bath coefficient. You can see, for example, the t statistics and the p-value. Here, for example, the different coefficients are significant. For example, for the relationship between proactiveness and scenario planning, so the coefficient is significant. It's the same thing for the risk taking, but you can see that the relationship between scenario planning and innovativeness is not significant because the t value is lower than 1.96. And
I think that's very clear, Arafet, but my question was that you look at the impact of scenario planning on innovativeness, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe innovative companies are doing more scenario planning anyway. You know,
Mm-hmm.
maybe the direction of the causality is the other way around than what you are doing.
Okay, so I understand your question. So here, we suppose that because here, as I said, this study is based on different articles that are published in scenario planning literature, and we see that scenario planning may have some direct and indirect outcomes. And here we have based our research in the definition of work of scenario planning, but also of some other studies that try to explore this relationship. So for this reason, we define this relationship. But I agree with you. That means, for example, the innovativeness may be also related to scenario planning. That means the direction it may be on the other sense. That means here in our model, we try to study the outcomes. That means what are the potential outcomes of scenario planning. For this reason, we try to work on this direct relationship between scenario planning, innovativeness, and so on.
Okay, thanks. I think we have questions from James, Jill, and Sam. Shall we start with James?
Hi there. Yeah, I have a question. So I've been involved in a number of organizations where scenario planning is an 8-month exercise. And I've been involved in organizations where scenario planning is set aside for a 2-day exercise. And typically the operational issues get in the way with the management team. And you're lucky if you actually spend half a day or a day on scenario planning. I'm really interested in whether you manage to assess and take into account to what extent and to what extent scenario planning was used in terms of, was it a short exercise, was it a long exercise, or how did you assess the level of engagement in scenario planning? Does that make sense?
So thank you so much for this question. So when I presented the sample, that I said that we sent our sample, our questionnaire, to 982 persons, and some of them said that we don't use scenario planning in our strategy, in our planning, and so on. For people who have answered, they said that they use scenario planning in their, for example, in their corporate strategy, and especially the engagement in scenario planning in terms of discussion, in terms of decision making, and especially the strategic decision making. This is but as you said, the degree of engagement is different from one company, from one company to other, because it depends on the situation of the company. It depends also on the degree of complexity. And for this reason, for example, when we have introduced the factor size, so in order to differentiate or to see whether the effect is the same, because, and just one thing that I have to add, in France, there is a law that people must have master degree in order to manage the healthcare, for example, institution and so on. And especially when all of them have received courses in scenario planning, in strategic foresight, and how to apply this tool to their organizations. So for this reason, we have asked this first question before the sample, before explaining the different dimensions and so on, and say that if you apply, if you have, for example, scenario planning in your practice, how to develop this tool, how to develop scenarios, and so on.
So, okay, thanks for that, Arafat. So that basically means that in this situation, you managed to identify which organizations were involved in scenario planning, and you had a level of confidence that those that answered positively had been consistent in the way that they applied scenario planning. Perfect, thank you.
Welcome.
Jill?
I think you probably answered my question there in your answer to James, but I was interested in how you kind of got companies on board and how easy that was.
So if I understand your question, so here, so through the different dimension of scenario planning that we have developed, we try to discover how scenario planning is developed within the organization, because as you know, in practice, some companies that may use scenario planning, but they do not know that there is a theory of scenario planning.
Did you find it hard to get companies to speak to you?
I have contacted many people. I have a network. I have professional networks and so on. And I have some, for example, associations, some groups, in order to contact these people, in order to speak with them. And especially, it depends on the company. It depends on the manager, because some people and some managers are convinced that nowadays we cannot apply the strategic planning. We cannot apply forecasting. It's true that forecasting sometimes is important, but nowadays, because we have different changes, we have different new factors and so on, so they are obliged to use the term scenario in their planning. And during this pandemic crisis that I'm doing, that I have another paper, and I'm here to I have analyzed a different situation, and I see that there is an increase in using scenario planning, because there is strong uncertainties, and people are not able to predict what is the development of this pandemic, what is the situation of the future environment, and so on. So as I said, this one of the specificity of this sector that we are talking about people. That means that the patient, for example, we are talking with a sample of people. That means that the customer or the users of this service are different from the classical customer. For example, I will take the sector of telecommunication or another industry. So here we have always to understand the evolution of the population, what are their needs, how to keep the link, for example, between the patient and their family, and so on. For this reason, we have, yeah.
So how many companies were in the sample?
I think 1,033 companies.
Okay, so this was data that was already there. You didn't contact the 1,000.
I contacted, I think, 1,000.
Oh gosh,
company.
right? Okay, gosh.
Yeah. and I received, for example, a positive. They said that the research is very interesting, but unfortunately, we don't use scenario planning.
Yeah.
We don't use because maybe they use, but in a formal way. That means it's not mentioned in their strategy decision process. And for this reason, we have the rate of 50% in terms of response.
Wow, really good.
Good.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Sam, last question.
Yeah. Firstly, can I hijack this opportunity to introduce Grace, you have seen in the chat. Grace Akula joining us from COMIAS, which is very encouraging to see our colleagues from COMIAS coming along to our seminars. Now to my question. I know you did talk about reliability and things, but I wondered, you know, I'm looking especially at the slide there, and I'm thinking there are, you know, clear conceptual overlaps between, say, you know, information acquisition, dissemination, and elements of innovation, risk-taking, proactiveness. And I wondered if there was any kind of, you know, collinearity between the individual elements for all the different questions, and if maybe you are able to kind of you know, decompose all of that by binding everything together and maybe doing like a Cronbach alpha or factor analysis to confirm that the items are clustering in a way that is consistent with the concepts that they're supposed to map onto.
So thank you so much for your question, which is very interesting. So as I said that in our empirical model, we have applied different types of tests in order to detect if there is a common behavior, if there is a relationship between the different concepts or dimensions. First of all, the first thing that we have done, so we test the Cronbach alpha, and all the indicators are significant. I think that they are higher than 0.7. So according to Cronbach, I think in 1983. So when you have this the coefficient, that means in terms of reliability, all dimensions are significant. Secondly, we have applied in order to test this reliability. We test the average variance extracted, and here we applied different equations in order to test the reliability. Another thing that I have done, so the bootstrapping, and in order also to detect if there is some deviation in terms of relationship. Then we applied, I think, the approach of Fernel and Larkin in 1981 in order to test the relationship between the constructs. For example, what is the relationship between knowledge dissemination and scenario development, then risk-taking and proactiveness, and all coefficients are significant. So applied, if I'd like to summarize, I have applied the reliability indicators, then the different types of validities in order to test our hypothesis. And last thing, as I said, the bootstrapping. So here we have the sample 1033. We have used a sample of, I think, 2000. We have this bootstrapping techniques in order to test the model, and the results are all significant.
Okay, I'm satisfied. Thank you.
Welcome.
We are just in time. I think this is a good opportunity to close this seminar. Arafet, thank you so much. It has been a pleasure to listen to your research status. Can I invite everybody to have a round of applause for Arafet, please?
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, it is not as loud as you would do in physical space, but we enjoyed very much. Thank you so much, Arafet.
Thank you, Abdullah, for this invitation. It's a great opportunity to discuss my paper with the different research from your laboratory. It's really a great pleasure. So I don't forget to thank you for, of course, my co-author status for always his work, and I'd like to thank you, Statis, very much, and for improving the quality of the paper and the presentation. So have a good day.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
See you all. Bye.